Hello, good people. It's the Big Heavy with part 2 of the Workcation series. If you missed part 1, there's a link up there to it somewhere floating in the ether where we talked about what a workation is and why it might be compelling and interesting for you and or your family. And today we're going to answer one of the big questions that probably jumps to your mind shortly after thinking through, do I want to take a workation or not? And that's, do I go domestic or do I go international? Now, I'll refer to the United States a lot when I talk about domestic, since that's kind of where I'm based. And despite my worldliness and culture, I am still an American. That's where most of my experience is. I think you can broadly apply what I'm going to say about the US to most other countries. But if I say something that's US centric, apologies, but hey, I am what I am. Now, I think when you start to consider a workation, it's pretty easy to go down the rabbit hole of, hey, I should go as exotic as possible. I should be on some island, hearing some different language with palm trees swaying and totally different people, totally different culture, different time zone, all of that exotic stuff that makes vacation type travel very interesting. But I would rein that in a little bit, because there are some pros and cons to both staying domestic and going to somewhere super exotic. We'll talk through some of those. We'll talk about some of the considerations. And again, ultimately, I'm going to wrap this series up with both a foreign workation for myself and my family, where we're going to spend some time in France, and then a domestic workation where we're going up and spending some time in New Hampshire. So this perspective comes from both our planning on those two workations, as well as some past workations that I've taken. Primarily the basis for that is we do an annual trip up to New Hampshire every year. We spend about a month there, and I end up working for the majority of that time before the workation term kind of became cool. We've been doing that for probably the last 6 or 7 years. I also have previous experience taking a, what I would style as a workation in Europe. I spent about 6 months in Paris and another 3 or 4 months in Italy with my wife and my oldest son, who at that point was about 6 or 7 years old. So I'll try and share some of those perspectives about traveling with very young children. You'll see how things go with our family now that they're older. That same dude that was 6 months old at that point is now going to be 13 when we go on this trip. We'll also have our 10-year-old daughter along, and our younger son, who will be 7 when we go on that European adventure. So you get a little bit of perspective on, can you do this with very tiny humans? I think the answer is unequivocally yes. Can you do this with, larger man-children / humans? And we'll try that out. I am fairly certain the answer will be yes as well. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of going to an international destination. And these are a little bit general, whether it's Europe or somewhere a little further afield. But probably the number one pro is you're going to get to experience another country and culture. Often when we travel for vacation, even if it's a couple-week vacation, you're getting a little bit of a flyby. You're probably going to the most interesting part of that country from a tourist perspective. You're probably staying in hotels or Airbnbs and closer to the tourist type attractions. So you're not necessarily getting immersed in the day-to-day vibe. You might go and have a couple breakfasts at the cafe down the street, or you might try and have some local experience. But just by virtue of the fact that you're only there for 3 to 15 days, it makes it a little hard to get that cultural immersion type experience that you can get with a workation, where you're probably going for 3, 4, potentially dozens of weeks, and really getting some time to spend in that culture, and potentially having your base of operations not be kind of a tourist epicenter. The other nice thing about a foreign workation is you can use wherever you're planning on staying longer term as kind of a base of operations, and then take a whole bunch of different side trips. You could go and base yourself somewhere in Europe, and on the weekend take a relatively inexpensive flight and go see other capitals if that was your thing. You could base yourself somewhere a little further out of the way, which is kind of our plan for France. In a future episode, I'll talk you through all the logistics and kind of what we're doing and where we're going. But we're staying outside of kind of the major tourist areas, and we've got a place where you can go and take some side trips up to the Pyrenees. We can jaunt into Rioja and see some of Spain. We can go and explore some of the regions of southern France a little bit. So you have a chance, if you're going on a foreign workation, to kind of explore a region. Similarly, if you went somewhere that was extremely far away, you only have to take that one gigantic flight on either end of your workation. So again, assuming I'm American, if I go to Australia or Vietnam or somewhere in Asia, I have to, suck it up for those 14-ish hours of flights or travel or whatever on the beginning of that and the tail end. But once I'm there, I could have a little base of operations and, say I was staying in Vietnam, I could take a little quick side trip to Thailand, I could take a little quick side trip to South Korea. You're kind of open to this whole other region that if you were doing a typical vacation would take, dozens of hours of flying time to reach. So how about some of the cons of taking an international workcation? So first off, the logistics are probably going to be a little bit more complex. There's probably airplanes involved, there might be rental cars, there's going to be potentially a different language that you'll have to navigate. You might need some form of visa, special health insurance, kind of all of these administrative things that you have to think through that you probably don't need to think through if you stay within your home country. There's also the potential of higher costs. Even if you're going to an extremely low-cost region, if I'm traveling to somewhere in Asia where the cost of living is extremely low, it's still potentially going to be expensive to fly out there. I've got to take some long flights. I have those hidden costs that might be everything from special health insurance to special visas. There might be a bit of a cost in terms of my work. If I'm in a very different time zone, I may have to adjust my waking hours to comply with my home time zone, which can be costly in terms of your rest and kind of personal well-being. And you've got the potential for a little bit of a higher risk of homesickness, and dealing with emergencies is going to be more complex. If you haven't traveled a ton internationally, don't underestimate the fact that after a week or two, you may really just want to rock a cheeseburger, or you may want to do something familiar. And instead you're in this place where nobody speaks your language, where things look a little different. People kind of look at you differently depending on where you are. I spent a lot of time in China, and there's just no hiding the fact that I'm a gigantic, large white human when I'm in a country full of small Chinese people. And after a while, it would get tiring having everyone sort of look at you like you're a weird, unusual creature in this habitat. And that can get a little grating on you, especially if you're experiencing that for a multitude of weeks. If you do have some sort of emergency situation, if you need to get home for medical care, if you've got a problem with a family member, or something's happened to your residents back home, it's going to be a little more complex to figure out how you get back. There might be some additional costs of that, and it might be 20 hours if you're lucky to get from wherever you are to home, versus if you're a couple states away, you can hop on a plane and be home in a couple or 3 hours. So let's look at some of those same pros and cons of staying domestic. In the case of the United States, in the case of places like Europe, Canada, Mexico, some of the larger countries, or even some of the European countries, there's so much breadth and depth and diversity of landscape, of people. There's these cultural nuances, and I know, if you drop me anywhere in the US, I'm probably going to see a Starbucks and a McDonald's and the same generic, crappy chain stuff. But there's still those cultural nuances that you can get a feel for when you stay somewhere longer. And I think it's easy for us to forget some of the mysteries and some of the interesting aspects of our home country and to underplay those. So, if you're thinking of, a workcation really should be to a super exotic location, and that's the only way I'm going to see stuff that's cool and unusual and interesting, don't discount the fact that even staying in your own country, you may be able to see some of those cool, amazing, and interesting things, and you may get to experience a different and nuanced culture. I've spent some time in Louisiana in the United States. Totally different culture than where I am, even though I'm in the Southeast. You go up to New England, there's some cultural nuances there. You go up to California, people think differently. Different parts of the states, they talk a little differently. You can even go to some parts of the US and hear different languages routinely spoken. Obviously, if you're from Europe, you can go jump a border or two and hear different languages, experience a very different culture. I was very surprised during our European workation in 2010-ish just how different kind of people approach the world and the cultures of the French versus the Italian. So there's lots of interesting experiences that are close to home. So don't discount that fact. The other pros are primarily around logistics. It's probably easier to travel within your home country. Generally you probably have the same language, at least in an official capacity, if you need help from the authorities or the government or whatnot. You probably don't need any visas or special permission to travel within your own country, and you should still have that shared nationality and kind of cultural bond with the people you're traveling amongst. That can be a pro or a con depending on how you look at it, but it is something that's presumably going to be there if you stay within your home country. In terms of cons, probably the big one is depending on where you go, it may end up feeling too similar to home after a while. You may have built up the idea of this workcation, you may have done all the logistical work, you got permission from your boss man or boss woman and did all this stuff. And then you end up landing somewhere, and after 4 days, you're like, hey, same old stuff as I saw at home. So there is that risk, and that's something you probably need to be a little more sensitive to when you're planning a domestic workation versus going out and planning something that's further afield. There's also the risk that costs might actually be higher. You may think, hey, I'm staying domestic, I can use that to limit my costs. But if I go from, say, the Southeast to New York City, my costs are going to be astronomically higher. If you go from the Midwest to California and LA or San Francisco, your costs might be astronomically higher. And there may be hidden costs along the way. Maybe you find a super cheap Airbnb that's a great deal and it looks awesome, but your food costs are 5x. Or a beer that costs $3 at home costs $18. And I have indeed seen $18 shitty light beer when I've been out in LA, like a 6x increase in your cost of living. So be sensitive to some of that, and be sensitive to the fact that maybe you're saving money in one area like travel, but you may have higher costs in areas like cost of living, cost of lodging, and all that. So try and factor in that whole picture, especially if you're sensitive to costs and you're trying to figure out, how do I make this work within a particular budget? And speaking of costs, we'll go into detail on how to budget for these things and plan out some of the costs. But speaking a little bit generally, don't make automatic assumptions about the location you're going to. I just mentioned how domestic could potentially be higher cost than international or vice versa, or you may go to a really low cost of living international location, but the costs to get there logistically are massive. So try and look at costs from a broad perspective. And don't forget the fact that a low cost area may have much, much lower services. I could probably get a cabin in Kabul for short money. It's probably pretty cheap to eat out there, but there's a bunch of risks being an American in Afghanistan. There's going to be some challenges with services if we need medical or whatnot. So balance out the fact that lower cost areas might have lower cost services, and you might not be able to get the connectivity or the access to communications that you need in order to work effectively, in which case your workcation potentially turns into a long vacation and potentially puts you at some risk with your employer. Even if you're staying in the US, there are still pretty broad parts of the United States that don't have good cell service, that might not have access to Wi-Fi. And you could be out in a beautiful vista in a RV living your best life, but you can't get any work done, and you end up missing some big crisis at work, and you end up getting in trouble, and no more workations for you or any of your colleagues. So think through those services as you're thinking through your costs and where you want to go. We'll talk more about this in the future, but you can also use things like frequent flyer miles to mitigate some of the costs. We're using frequent flyer miles for our airline tickets over to France. You can use credit card miles to cover things like lodging, and you can even do some tricks with miles to go and buy things like suitcases, or turn those into gift cards on Amazon, for Apple, for common vendors, so you can use that to defray some of your costs of gear and stuff that you're going to need to ultimately facilitate your workation. So to walk you through a case example, let me talk through some of our thought process on how we decided on France. So we knew we wanted to take the kids to Europe. They've never been to Europe. We've done a little bit of international travel to the Caribbean, to Mexico, but most of that was resort focused. They didn't really get to experience much of the culture or the language or anything like that. And my wife and I both have traveled to and briefly lived in Europe, so we're pretty comfortable with how things work. She speaks very competent French. I speak very incompetent French, but I'm a lot less shy about it, so I'm more than happy to go and run my trap and tell people that the red pig flies at dawn, when I'm really meaning to say, how are you today? You have a lovely home. And I kind of hope and expect that she'll backfill me, or I won't say anything that's too offensive, and I'll just kind of charge right in. So we had basic language competency. We kind of knew the geography and the culture a little bit. We had spent some time in Paris, where we're going to spend an initial few days once we take the kids over. So that made it pretty easy. Our other deciding factor was, where could we find a ticket that we could use miles for? So if you have some flexibility and kind of have a general region that you want to go to, the mileage thing can make sense. From a cost perspective, that could make sense if you kind of pick your region and then do a little research and figure out what fits within my budget, what fits within my timing, and what kind of works with my work schedule in terms of connectivity, in terms of time zones, and in terms of access to other people. On those fronts, I have a bunch of people that I work with in the UK, Scotland, and Ireland. I have a whole bunch of people that I nominally work with, but who I haven't had a chance to meet in person in Madrid, so I can scoot over there a little bit. I have some people in the Middle East and kind of that region. So from a time zone perspective, Europe works out pretty well for me. I also work with some Australians, so I'll be a little closer to their time zone. So, from a time zone perspective, Europe worked. From a culture perspective, Europe worked. From a interesting to the family perspective, Europe worked. And France seemed like a good option based on kind of understanding that language and culture and all of that. On our domestic workation front, so how do we decide on New Hampshire? As I mentioned, we've been going up there for a number of years. We have a family member that has a house up there, so that makes the lodging extremely easy. It's a place I used to go to as a kid, so I kind of know the area, I know what's going on. We go in the summers when it's hot down in the southeast. It's usually a little cooler with some exceptions up in New Hampshire. And it's a little bit of a different culture. It's a little bit of a different vibe. We're sort of up in the mountains. There's lots of outdoorsy things to do. You can go hike up a mountain. You can go jump in a lake. So there's lots of things for the kids to do while I'm working. And it's, an experience that's a little different than our day-to-day down here in the southeast. So we get that, slight cultural nuance. New England people are a little bit different than people in the Southeast. We get that kind of difference of activities. We get a little bit of a difference in climate. We get a little bit of a difference in scenery and geography, being up close to the mountains. And we still have easy lodging. It's relatively comparable cost of living in terms of food, groceries, all that stuff. And it has the advantage of being familiar. So, we know where to go to eat. We know where to go to hike. And that makes for a pretty easy transition. There's high quality Wi-Fi. I have a good enough workstation up there, so I can still get work done while everyone else is out having fun and jumping in a lake. So hopefully that gives you some things to think about as you're trying to decide, do I go foreign or domestic? Do I focus on culture? Do I focus on costs? Some of the other factors that should help you guide that decision. And next up, we'll talk about traveling with a family. I'll talk about some of the issues and thought process that I was considering back when we did that initial workcation, when it was just my wife and essentially a newborn. You can apply some of that thinking if you don't have kids and you have a spouse, partner, domestic, whatever you want to call it, person that lives with you and presumably enjoys your company and wants to go places with you. Or, maybe you have a family of 10 that you're trying to figure out, how the hell do we bring these people along from a logistical perspective? So I'll try and strike that balance and give you some food for thought. And again, we'll ultimately have you tag along as we voyage up to France and New Hampshire at the culmination of this cavalcade of whimsy. Until then, this is the Big Heavy wishing you safe travels and wishing you adventures both foreign and domestic. Peace.
Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.